Okay, so this is a short video on trade unions and pressure groups. Right, so the first thing is, what's a trade union? For those of you who don't know, trade unions have their origins in the Industrial Revolution, so roughly speaking the start of the 19th century, and were created in an attempt by workers to improve their working conditions. They're more common in the public sector, so in those jobs where people are employed by the government rather than in the private sector. There are some large unions which are now in the public sector, but they tend to be in those jobs which used to be in the public sector, if that makes sense. So things like the railway workers and post office workers, they used to be owned by the government, and traditionally they've held on to sort of, that position of being in unions. The other thing to say about them is that they've traditionally supported the Labour Party and have provided funding to it. So the Labour Party was a political party created to represent the workers. You'll see that in Prime Minister's Question Time, whenever the Labour Party criticised government policy about workers, Rishi Sunak always refers to them, or quite often refers to them, as union paymasters, to try to make a big deal out of the fact that some of the funding for the Labour Party comes from the unions. Examples of unions, well, you've got the National Education Union, the Railway and Maritime Workers Union, the British Medical Association. They're all examples of unions. Just be a little bit careful, though, as they may not have union in their name. So the next question is, why join a union? Well, firstly, they can demand pay rises for whole job sectors, such as teachers or nurses. And you can see that that's been going on recently, where nurses have gone on strike because they want a pay rise for every single nurse in England and Wales, also Scotland, but they have different agreements with the different governments. They can demand improvement in working conditions. So it used to be the case that if you were pregnant and you wanted to go on maternity leave, you wouldn't be paid. Nowadays that's changed, so maternity pay is part of people's pay and conditions. They can provide legal help in disputes with employers. So if you feel that you've been unfairly dismissed, they can provide legal help. They can also take actions such as striking. That's, I guess, the ultimate sort of thing that unions can do, which is basically to withdraw your labour from a company, and so you can put the organisation under pressure. As a group working together, they can make a difference. It's not always the case. The miners' strike, for example, failed. The government has also introduced legislation or laws to limit the power of the unions and to prevent or minimise disruption. The other thing that you have to do is, you can't just go on strike whenever you like. You have to ballot or vote for a strike. The last thing to say is that most private sector employers don't recognise unions in their workplace. At the moment, for example, there's a dispute going on with Amazon workers in a Coventry warehouse, where about 300 of them have gone on strike, but Amazon basically sort of say, well, we don't recognise that strike action as we don't recognise the union. Right, the next thing is, what's a pressure group? Basically, a pressure group is a single issue group that takes action to highlight an issue such as climate change or animal rights. You often see pressure groups mentioned on TV, and you often think that they're quite controversial, but actually they can include sort of really quite benign groups, such as the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. Basically, it's a group which is interested in wildlife. They're not the same as a political party which has views about lots of issues and seeks political power. Pressure groups don't seek political power at all. They're just there to try and lobby the government to think about what they're talking about in any sort of decisions that the government may make. So, for example, climate protesters may take action to force the government to change its policies and become more green. So build more wind turbines, put solar powers on new buildings, that kind of thing. You can see those kind of traditional pressure groups. They're things like Greenpeace and Oxfam. There are also newer groups such as Extinction Rebellion, which are often more radical in their approach. Again, why join one? Well, you might want to join one because you want to make a difference about an issue you care about. You may also feel that the government is not listening to you and that working in a group is more effective. Lastly, you can decide whether you want to join a pressure group which is taking direct action, such as protests, which can include violent protests, although that's against the law, obviously, or indirect action, such as publicity, leaflets, writing letters, etc. As a group working together, yeah, of course they can make a difference. Climate change protesters have highlighted the issue of climate change and have resulted in the government taking action about this. However, it may not always be the case. The other problem is with pressure groups are that direct action often alienates people by causing significant disruption. Glue yourself to a road where people are trying to travel to and from work, and you're probably not going to make yourself very popular. In contrast, indirect action may not get as much attention either. So you can see that there are sort of for and against in terms of joining a pressure group. Anyway, I hope this short video will help clear up any sort of questions that you may have about the role of unions and also pressure groups.